Bonjour, Madame, Monsieur. Je voudrais me excuser. I have to do this presentation in English because, as you have heard, my French is extremely poor. I should also apologise because, as a Scot, I speak English extremely quickly. So I will try to slow down to afford you the opportunity to follow what I'm saying. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to talk to you about Glasgow Museum Resources Centre and to explain a little about our service so you understand the context within which we operate. Glasgow Museum Resources Centre is part of the city's civic museum service. It's entirely funded by the citizens of Glasgow through their local taxes. We receive no central or national government money, which is a continual source of contention and concern in Glasgow. But nonetheless, the city has historically delivered a very large and impressive service despite this limitation. Glasgow Museums is a service very much loved by the citizens of Glasgow. They have taken it to their heart, they visit in very large numbers, and they support it across all sectors of society. Currently, we operate 8 museums and 2 storage sites. This is our, I suppose, our main museum, Kelvin Grove Museum and Art Gallery, built at the turn of the 19th into 20th century, and normally attracts well over 1 million visitors a year, and is a very dramatic civic space, giving a visual impression of Glasgow's ambition and its investment and enthusiasm for its cultural sector. We operate, in addition to this large museum, a number of other fairly significant buildings. No. Let's see. This is the Riverside Transport Museum, which we opened in 2011. If you're not familiar with the building, it was Museum of the Year in 2013, and the building was designed by Zaha Hadid and contains the city's transport collection, but also a wide variety of other items, fine art, costume, and social history, and this has proved extremely successful and now attracts 1.3 million visits per annum. This is the People's Palace, which is our oldest venue and has, as you will see, a winter gardens attached to the back. This was built in the 19th century as a place of entertainment and education for the working people of Glasgow. And the palace, perhaps more than any other part of our service, explains the close association with Glasgow Museums with the working classes in the city. And this is one which, again, you might have seen before. This is the Borough Collection, which is currently undergoing refurbishment. This was a building created specifically to house a collection donated to the city by a wealthy industrialist in the mid-20th century, some 9,000 objects of fine and decorative art. The collection of the Borough typifies Glasgow. 90% of the services collections were donated to us, and they have come from the city's industrialists who've made substantial sums of money in the 19th and 20th century, but as we'll see shortly, not necessarily in the late 20th century and 21st century. So the service runs a wide variety of buildings to support its operations. Currently, we attract 3.9 million visitors per annum across the service, of which 37% are Glaswegians. To do the calculation, that means that we have 1.4 million visits each year from Glaswegians. And from a city with a population of less than 600,000, it means that every single Glaswegian visits a museum or gallery on average 2.3 times a year. We confidently believe this is the highest level of use of museums and galleries anywhere in the UK. And I would challenge you to come up with figures which compete with that number. So the service is very dearly beloved by Glaswegians. We're now also attracting 1.4 million visits from tourists. And this is a major shift for Glasgow, as I'll mention later in the presentation, to be from having been a post-industrial city to one which has a very large tourist footfall. Glasgow has the largest civic museum service in the United Kingdom. It's the largest museum service outside London, outside the London Nationals. We represent 1/3 of the entire museum sector in Scotland, and we deliver all of this on what we consider to be a very modest budget of around £13 million a year, which is, I think, quite parsimonious and quite good value for the citizens of Glasgow. The service was established more than 150 years ago and is part of life for many working class citizens. We enjoy a much wider demographic in our audience than is typical for UK museums. As you may or may not know, in the UK we conventionally divide the population into social class groups from A to E in 6 categories. I know there are only 5 letters, but there are 6 categories. A is for higher managerial and professional. B is for middle-ranking managerial and professional. C1 is supervisory. C2 is skilled, and D is semi-skilled, and E is for unskilled and unemployed. In the UK, on average, 47% of museum visitors would come from the upper A-B category, and only 13% from the lower D and E categories. In Glasgow, these figures are very different. To our museums, 24% of visitors come from the A-B category, and an astonishing 31% come from the D and E category. So our very large museum service in turn attracts an extremely large audience from people in poorer paid jobs and people who are unemployed. And this is very important for the city and represents a key part of what the museum service does for Glasgow. This reflects in part the historic affection that Glaswegians have for museums. In Glasgow, it's an accepted and conventional thing for working class people to attend museums, in particular Kelvin Grove, the one I showed you at the beginning. It also reflects the service's international reputation for engagement to support economic regeneration and health and well-being. The city has invested very heavily in its museum service since 1983, when the borough was launched as a new museum, and we've seen this as a core part of the economic reinvention of Glasgow. As a post-industrial city in the 1980s, Glasgow was advised to manage decline, and the City Council decided that they wouldn't do that. They would find a way to reinvent the city and to reinvigorate new industries. They invested in the cultural sector to drive that change, and as of this part in the 21st century, there's very strong evidence to suggest that that has been so far extremely successful. We have delivered an increase in visitor numbers, but critically, substantial increase in tourists to Glasgow. 70% of tourists to our city visit a museum or gallery whilst they're staying there. 45% of tourists to Glasgow identify visiting a museum or gallery as a key driver for the presence in the city. And since the year 2000, the proportion of tourists visiting Glasgow has quadrupled. This chart shows you the change in visitor numbers since 1999. The dip in 2003 to 2005 is when the Kelvin Grove Museum was closed for refurbishment and reopened in 2006 to enormous success. As you can see, there was an explosion in numbers to over 4 million in 2007, where Kelvin Grove alone attracted over 2 million visits. Numbers stabilised to about 2.5 million prior to the opening of the new Transport Museum, when again they moved upwards and we're currently delivering consistently around 4 million visits a year. This is an absolutely key part of the city's tourism aspiration, and it's vitally important the service continues to deliver this. That's to give you some background and context. What I propose to do is to explain Glasgow Museum Resources Centre to you by addressing a number of, I think, fundamental questions to explain how this place operates. The first is, what is Gmrc? This is a photo of the building, which probably tells you very little, other than it's a very large white box. Gmrc is a combined facility and houses a conservation team, administration staff, curators, managers, alongside a reserve collection. We currently house around 800,000 objects here, out of a collection of about 1.2 million, across all the key areas of collection: natural history, fine art, transport, science, arms and armour, and fine art. Social history and archaeology are currently moving into the final phase of another development, which I'll mention briefly at the end of the presentation. This co-location of objects is not particularly novel. What is, however, is the extent and quality of public access we've been able to provide with this facility. We attract more than 15,000 annual visits to Gmrc on tours of stores and workshops, and we are informed that this is the most visited storage facility in the world. The centre also acts as a bespoke base for academic study of our collection, facilitating access to the collection and professional analysis of the objects. The centre cost £25 million in 2 phases, all funded by the city. So that gives you some sense of what Gmrc is. The next significant point is where Gmrc is. This is a shot of inside the facility. This is one of the tours looking at the Arms and Armour collection. We are open 360 days a year, offering general tours and bespoke tours to look at all aspects of the collection. This provides a very high quality experience tailored to the individual visitor, which is a significant part of its success. I asked, where is Gmrc? And this is a relatively unattractive shot of one of Glasgow's suburbs. Gmrc is based in Nits Hill, which is a suburb of Glasgow to the south of the city. Originally a mining village, the mines have long since closed down, and the area has become notorious for urban deprivation and indeed until relatively recently for gang culture, an area of Glasgow which suffered from all of the worst aspects of deprivation and was desperately in need of regeneration. The aspiration was to place Gmrc here as a way of kick-starting that regeneration and to change the perception of Nits Hill and to encourage inward investment. By using a piece of relatively inexpensive land which the council owned, we were able to build the store at a relatively modest cost and to provide a new impetus to this part of Glasgow. This is a wider shot of Gmrc and some of Nits Hill to give you a sense of the context for the building. This is not an obvious location to place a store in which you locate an extremely valuable collection. Glasgow's civics collection is unusual because of the way in which it was secured, that much of the collection is of remarkably high value. Ranging from Rembrandt to Turner through contemporary art and Dali, the collection has many remarkably expensive items. We house them in Gmrc, and despite being in an underprivileged area of the city, we haven't found it necessary to provide a security fence. Thanks to the work done by the staff in the centre to establish relationships with the local community, the community regard the building as their asset, and consequently we've never suffered from vandalism, despite the centre operating in this area for more than 11 years. As an example of how the way in which the service builds a relationship within communities that can help to make people feel that the cultural offer is actually an inherent part of their rights as a citizen and an inherent part of what they can get from the city. Why was Gmrc built here? It was built to give voice to the regeneration of the city and to help to support public access to the collections. It was built in two phases, around the creation of the refurbished Kelvin Grove and the creation of the new Transport Museum. In case you're wondering, this is not a shot of storage in Gmrc. This is a shot of how the collection was stored in Kelvin Grove prior to the refurbishment. If you contrast this with the shot of Arms and Armour a couple of slides ago, you'll understand the improvement we've been able to make, both in terms of the conditions for the collection, but also in terms of the access for the collection. And I'm not exactly sure why the Queen is here, or what part she ever played in the history of Glasgow, but nonetheless there is Her Majesty, and obviously one or two of you recognised her. This is an example of the storage for the transport collection, which was in the old Museum of Transport in the city centre. And again, this has moved to Gmrc to provide the same quality of access that we have for the other parts of the collection. The centre was built in two phases, initially between 2003 and 2006 to house the Kelvin Grove material, and then a further phase from 2010 to 2011 to hold material from the old Museum of Transport. This is just a shot of the inside of the refurbished Kelvin Grove to prove we did spend some money on it. So this is our main museum. Roger the elephant is one of the most beloved stuffed animals we have in the collection and has been on display in Kelvin Grove for over a century. You can see the new approach to displays in this shot here. And this is the street inside the Museum of Transport. Again, one of our most popular exhibits, and allows us to change the transport objects inside this environment and also to change the content of the shops. So the Transport Museum changes frequently trying to maintain interest and entice new groups into using the service. This investment in culture, as I mentioned earlier, was to allow us to address the economic decline of Glasgow. Gmrc was an integral part of that. This gives some idea of the problem the city faced. In 1961, West Central Scotland, which primarily means Glasgow, the majority of the Scottish population live in and around the city of Glasgow, had almost 550,000 people employed in industry, 51% of the total workforce. This was about the high point in terms of industrial employment in west of Scotland. From the 1960s, the numbers went into very steep decline. By 2006, almost two-thirds of those jobs had disappeared. That's 358,000 jobs which had gone from the local area. These industries had simply evaporated. Over this same period of time, Glasgow experienced an incredibly rapid loss of population. From a high point of around 1 million citizens in the middle of the 20th century, the city slumped to almost 500,000, and there was unemployment rates reached 30%. The city therefore had to find a way to reinvent itself, and rather than provide immediately industrial areas and competitive rental, Glasgow invested heavily in culture to create a quality of life which would attract inward investment and which would energise the population to improve their health and make them more economically productive. Glasgow has been very successful in doing this. A relatively large share of the working age adults, employment has increased by 16.5% between 2000 and 2008. The third highest level of commercial property investment in the UK. Productivity is the sixth highest in Scotland, and GVA growth predicted at 2.5%. You have to be careful. Productivity being the sixth highest in Scotland is not that good, because Scotland's productivity is relatively low. Nonetheless, this is a major improvement on where the city used to be. Unemployment rates at the lowest level post-2008. The graduate level workforce is well above competitor cities. In fact, astonishingly, Glasgow has the second highest level of graduate employment in the UK after Bristol. And we were European Entrepreneurial Region of the Year in 2016. We have the fastest growing economy in the UK. Youth unemployment has been halved. Increase in business base, substantial. The number of adults with no qualifications has decreased by 8.3%. Youth unemployment has gone down in the last couple of years, and youth inactivity has decreased. So the city has managed to create substantial changes in economic performance through this investment in culture. Gmrc is an important part of delivering this. It supports studies and tours of the collection, but more than that, it acts as a stepping stone from being disengaged to being fully involved in the cultural participation of the city. The demographics in Gmrc are quite interesting. 42% visitors are male, 58% female. Average age of visitor, 47 years. The audience is predominantly local. About 75% of visitors come from Glasgow, 25% from the rest of Scotland. Significantly, 50% of visitors to Gmrc are from the least affluent areas in the city, which is obviously our key target demographic. In terms of ethnicity, Gmrc attracts 12% of its audiences from the BAME community. Again, this is very important to us. Glasgow has the highest proportion of immigration in Scotland. 12% of the city's population wasn't born there. Looking at museums across the board, they're massively underrepresented in our audience. So to our mainstream museums, they represent only about 3% of the audience. In Gmrc, we've managed to get that figure up, so the proportion of BME audience exactly mirrors that in the city. Gmrc visitors are almost certain to attend as part of an organised group and will attend an organised session. 46% of users, in fact, come in some kind of organised event. Gmrc doesn't operate in isolation, however. The Open Museum kits are a product of our Open Museum service. This part of the organisation works with communities and is our frontline force. Their job is to establish new relationships and to use those to involve people in initial cultural activity. Having developed confidence in the individuals, we then provide pathways for them to move from that very bespoke, very expensive service through into mainstream provision. This is an example of handling kits which the Open Museum develops in conjunction with community groups, and they can be used to travel around old people's homes and hospitals, schools and other public areas to provide people access to our collections and also to their own cultural heritage. We also provide significant opportunities for engagement through programmes and activities. This is a family session again at Glasgow Museum Resources Centre, encouraging people to come in, to engage with us, to influence our contemporary collecting, and to find ways in which they can access the collection and understand and appreciate our collection. All of this helps us to move people from disengagement to being more actively involved in civic society, improving their health and well-being, and improving their economic potential. The Open Museum was established in 1990 and operates outside of our buildings, building these relationships and using existing relationships and trust to develop that with new people. It works in all sorts of communities, from the most disadvantaged areas right through to Glasgow's prison community, to find ways to make them engage more effectively with civic society. Gmrc offers one of the routes out from the Open Museum into the mainstream service. Through bespoke tours, we can find areas of interest and support visitors to begin to engage with our collections. We believe the evidence from scientific studies indicates that health and well-being benefits derive very strongly from cultural engagement, and the centre is a key part of delivering these benefits to the city's population, improving therefore its economic potential. The development at Gmrc, being related to museum refurbishments, only provided for about 80% of the storage capacity we required. We still had our social history and archaeology collections which were in unsuitable storage. So we've taken the opportunity of an available building in Glasgow and a developing partnership with the Hunterian University Museum, the National Libraries of Scotland, to develop Kelvin Hall, a former exhibition centre in Glasgow, into a new combined storage centre and community display centre. This is some of the community displays in the entrance avenue in Kelvin Hall. This is the outside of the building, which shows the new part to the right-hand side. Currently, this building is only 1/3 developed. It will, when it's complete, hold 2 million objects from our collection and from the Hunterian, and mean that all of the key collections in Glasgow have the same level and quality of access that we've been able to develop at Gmrc. So we're transposing the Gmrc model into this brand new facility. And this is another shot of the inside of Kelvin Hall. This also has, unusually, a very large sports complex, so it contains the city's largest gym, 3 dance studios, and squash courts, and a gymnastics hall. The idea being to encourage people in to partake in the sport offer, but also to be able to engage them with the cultural offer whilst they're there. Why do we like Glasgow Museum Resources Centre? Gmrc has proved an effective way to be able to reach out to the most disadvantaged and the most disengaged members of the city's community. By doing this, we can begin to address the economic potential of the 50% of Glasgow's citizens who are either unemployed or in poorly paid work and underqualified. The city has managed to reinvent itself substantially over the last 30 years, and this aerial photograph shows you the scale of new building alongside the preservation of the historic centre of Glasgow, which that has achieved. The city is convinced that its investment in culture is what's driven this, which is why the city continues to invest in culture, and we continue to develop the Gmrc concept to deliver in other centres. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup.